Hey guys, Mr. Ham here. This week we're going to be talking about the Reagan years in the 1980s and kind of the rise of conservatism. So while we do this, make sure you're filling out the guided practice that's listed alongside this assignment. That'll be how we're going to track credit for this assignment. So to talk about the 1980s, we really first have to kind of understand who Ronald Reagan is and kind of the background of his politics and where he comes from. So Ronald Reagan is a really interesting figure because Ronald Reagan actually started his career as an actor. He moved out to California in the 1930s and began working as an actor in California, doing television, doing film, and he was a movie star at the time during the 1930s, 40s, and through the 50s, and he even served as the Screen Actor Guild's president at the time. So this is a very witty, charming, public figure who is used to being in front of a camera, someone that is a great speaker, a great debater, someone that has great conversational skills. And so this is a really important background for Ronald Reagan as we talk about kind of what he does in politics and kind of his public perception from here on out. So his perception is a really interesting one because it really depends on what side of the political aisle you sit on how you view Ronald Reagan typically. So on the left hand here, we can see some of these red terms here, some of the negative things that are associated with Ronald Reagan. Things like union busting, ignoring the AIDS epidemic, the Iran-Contra crisis. Some of these things we're going to talk about today are definitely viewed as negatives by a large group of people that study Ronald Reagan. Whereas on the right-hand side, we have a lot of other terms. Things like the Great Communicator was a title that he was known as. And we can see the optimism, things that he brought to the presidency that really hadn't been there for years. He was very witty, very charming. He was someone that worked well with people across the aisle, worked well with Democrats a lot of times. So we're going to talk a lot about Reagan, some of the positives, some of the negatives, and spend some time with his presidency. So in 1980, there's a new presidential election. The incumbent, Jimmy Carter, is a Democrat, and he has been president now for 4 years. And Jimmy Carter is someone that is a really interesting character as well because he faced a lot of opposition from within his party. So during the primaries leading up to the 1980 election, Jimmy Carter actually faced a lot of opposition. So a very popular Democratic figure at the time was Ted Kennedy. So remember the Kennedys. We have John F. Kennedy, who's assassinated. We have Robert Kennedy, who was running for presidency and was also assassinated. And now we have the third brother, Ted Kennedy. And Ted Kennedy pushed Jimmy Carter, and it was a very, very close nomination. But Jimmy Carter ends up winning out. So even at the time, he was shaky among Democrats. His presidency saw very high inflation, very poor foreign policy records. There was the oil and energy crisis as well. And so Jimmy Carter, he was actually a fairly unpopular president, especially at the time this election rolls around. And Ronald Reagan is a really interesting character because on the national stage, he was known as an actor. He was not someone that was seen as this heavy hitter in the political field, people like Jimmy Carter and Ted Kennedy especially. Um, but he's someone that helped purge communists in the 1950s working in Hollywood. Remember the Red Scare? A lot of the focus was on Hollywood and how communists might be infiltrating it. And he was someone that was fighting against that. He also did serve as governor of California for 8 years, so he did have some political background. It just wasn't as much on the national stage. He was very popular because he is someone that championed the common man kind of against big government. There was this rising conservative movement at the time that wanted to see the power of the national government reduced. And so what we mean by that is whenever the federal government gets involved in local affairs. So that's taxation, that is regulations on industries, on businesses and stuff like that. Reagan and this conservative movement felt like those things were hampering the economy, and that was a big part of why the economy was failing under Jimmy Carter. He was also a great debater. Jimmy Carter is a very nice guy. He is someone that is seen as a very kind figure, but he is not seen as this witty, charming character. And now you have Ronald Reagan, this actor, come on the stage and is very popular. And this ends up helping Reagan win in a landslide. His victory, you can see here, he had 489 of the needed 500 of the total 538 votes. You only need 270 to win, and he had 489, so he nearly doubles the needed votes for it. So this is surprising at the time, again, because you have Jimmy Carter and his presidency, which has been there for 4 years, getting beaten by this kind of upstart conservative movement. And so Reagan really establishes this conservative cabinet. So he surrounds himself with very conservative people as well. And he wanted to reduce the federal budget. That was one of his number one goals, was to stop the spending on the national level. All this money that is being spent, he wanted to stop that. And so you can see this quote down here at the bottom. Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. And this is a very fundamental difference between the conservatives and the liberals at this time. Spending money. Should the government be spending money to help fix things, or should they back off and allow businesses to fix themselves? And that was the conservative movement, was to give businesses the freedom to work this out. So he finds a common ally in someone that you're probably familiar with, Great Britain. And Great Britain at the time was going through a very similar movement. They had elected a woman named Margaret Thatcher. She is the newly elected Prime Minister of Great Britain. And she also really wants to improve her nation's economy. And so she does a lot of things that Reagan would do. They mirror each other a lot of times. She reduces the power of labor unions. She gives the businesses more power, not as much labor. She also reduces the government's involvement in business. And again, there's a lot of parallels between Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. And they were allies both on economics, as we can see, but also in foreign policy. So there's a couple quotes over here on the right. You can see, "The state is your servant, not your master. And no one dares take from the people what we have given back to the people." So here's a few images of Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. And again, this really cements the two as very strong allies at the time. So the Cold War is obviously still going on at this time period as well. And of course, as the American president, Reagan has to become involved in this. Now, go ahead and watch this video if you get the chance. This is a short campaign ad by Reagan, and Reagan comes out very strongly against the Soviet Union. He sees them as a threat, and he appeals to people's kind of wanting to crush them, because before this, the presidency and the United States had worked on containment and détente. So this is basically working with the Soviets and trying to come to agreements, and relationships have started to kind of warm up. There's conversations going on, and it's a pretty far cry from the Cuban Missile Crisis and everything. There's constant communication. Well, Reagan doesn't want to accommodate communism. He wants to destroy it. So he doesn't want to allow it to exist. He wants to get rid of it. And so he condemns the Soviet Union as the focus of evil in the modern world. So, I mean, think about that term, talking about the focus of evil in our modern world. Very strong terms coming out against communism. And so during his first term in office, spoiler, he gets 2 terms, this really worsens relationships between the Soviet Union and the United States. So we're just kind of on this roller coaster where we have this low point of like the Cuban Missile Crisis and everything, and then slowly after that it starts rising, through Vietnam and everything, and now or after Vietnam and everything, and then now it's starting to drop again with Reagan. But again, he starts forging these bonds around the world. People like Margaret Thatcher are key allies in this fight against communism. So it's an interesting chart here. We can see some of the military spending throughout the time period. So we can see the red, of course, are Republican presidents, and the blue are Democratic presidents. So the spending, Reagan ends up increasing spending on the military by a pretty significant margin. So he wanted peace through strength. And what we mean by that is a massive increase in defense spending. So in 1981, when he took office, the spending was about $150 billion. But by 1985, the end of his first term, it was $250 billion. So $250 billion on military spending. And a lot of this went into nuclear weapons. And this really upset the USSR. So this really upset the Soviets. And they ended up boycotting the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. So we were hosting the Olympics that year in LA, and the Soviets boycotted. And so the Soviet Union, who had been competing with the United States, throughout this, they decided not to come. They do not enter into the Olympics this year. So this is a pretty major statement on their behalf. So this is the Olympiad here. This is the Rose Bowl. You can see some of that. Now, something interesting is happening, though, in the Soviet Union at the time. So Brezhnev is the premier of the Soviet Union, and he kind of sees the height and the power of it, and then it starts to decline. Their economy can't keep up, and the agriculture in the country starts to fail. So again, they have millions of people in the Soviet Union, and their industries and everything like that start to fail. And so they have to start importing products. Remember, a big part of the Soviet Union was strength in communism and how they can provide for themselves and everything. And now we're seeing that the Soviet Union needs to import products. And a key event in all this was that there was a Polish uprising in a factory, whereas previously in the Soviet Union, this would have been crushed. There would have been executions and jailings, and this factory would have been shut down or completely redone. But now they had to give in, and they start allowing unions in the country, so the people start getting a voice. So, a key part of Reagan's battle against the Soviets was this idea of strategic defense initiative. It's also known as Star Wars. Remember, the movie Star Wars had come out, and it's the biggest thing at the time. And this basically, think about this idea in the middle of the 1980s, called for an orbiting battle station in space that could fire laser beams to vaporize intercontinental missiles upon takeoff. So basically, these satellites would be floating above the atmosphere, and they would be watching out for things taking off and everything like that, and they would vaporize them before they can attack. Now, most scientists say that this was impossible, but pitching this pitching this arms contest onto kind of this high level of technology and stuff like that, he knew that this would push the Kremlin. He knew that this would push the Soviets. Remember, we have the space race where the United States and the Soviets are competing, for traveling to space and everything like that. He saw this as kind of the next phase of that, competing with the Soviets and making them spend money on answering this, which if their economy and everything like that is failing, having them spend money is a great position for the United States to be in. So, in 1985, a guy named Mikhail Gorbachev becomes the premier of the Soviet Union. And Gorbachev has a pretty unique view compared to most Soviets, and he believed the United States, the only way to help the Soviet Union was to strike up this deal with the United States. And so they begin meeting with each other. Gorbachev and Reagan begin meeting with each other, and they come up with this idea. This result is the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which ordered the destruction of this kind of class of weapons. So these longer range missiles and stuff like that, it ordered the destruction of these. And so it's a pretty big deal for the Soviets and the United States to come to this agreement after these years of kind of tension and everything. So this is Gorbachev here. Anytime, he has a pretty distinct birthmark, and you can see that pretty much in every picture and everything like that, cartoons and all that kind of stuff. So here is a pretty obvious one. We have Reagan on the left here as Luke Skywalker, and Gorbachev on the right. If you know anything about Star Wars, these two are mortal enemies. And by the end of the series, again, spoiler, if you haven't seen any Star Wars, it turns out they're family and they forgive each other. So, yeah, pretty good cartoon at the time. And again, we see Reagan and Gorbachev meeting with one another and having these conversations and everything like that, which, again, this would be unheard of earlier in, Soviet and U.S. relationships. So Reagan's presidency starts on a very low point between relationships, and throughout the years, he starts to increase this. So it seems like the Cold War is almost over. And by 1987, so this is the very end of Reagan's presidency, Berlin is still divided, though. So remember, we have the city of Berlin. It's divided between East and West, and the West was covered in bright and colorful paintings, and it's essentially a Western country, whereas East Berlin is still patrolled by Soviet guards. It is still basically under lockdown at the time. So we can see some images here, some paintings and stuff like that on the walls. A lot of artwork and everything at the time. And so Reagan goes to the Brandenburg Gate. It's this massive gate in Berlin, and he gives a speech. It's the same place that JFK gave his speech at the time. And it's in West Berlin, obviously, but it's so close that the citizens of East Berlin could hear it. So the speech is really to both sides, and he begins to call out the leader. He begins to call out Gorbachev. He says, "Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And it's a very famous soundbite you can see pretty much anywhere. Now, the Soviets don't respond immediately, but in time the Soviets would end up answering. So this is an image here of the speech he's given, the Brandenburg Gate right in the background. And here's a cartoon here of Reagan breaking through the wall, and of course the Soviet Union crumbling in front of Gorbachev. So that's kind of the rosy side of the Reagan presidency, and we're going to talk a lot more about what happens with Reagan and everything, but it's important to talk about a lot of the things that happened during his presidency as well that were seen as major negatives. So communism, just like with the last few decades, is taking place around the world, this fight against communism. And a big issue came up in Latin America. So Latin America is Central and Southern America, and the U.S. supported several anti-communist governments and rebel groups in Central and South America. That doesn't always mean that these were great people. A lot of times these were very repressive regimes, very repressive groups that were um, either dictatorships or even drug lords almost controlling some of these countries, but they weren't communist, and so they had the support of the United States. And it was seen as kind of this necessary evil. Yes, these might not be the best governments in the world, but anything is better than communism. So, two countries became the focus, and that's El Salvador and Nicaragua. And these are in Central America. So, I think you can see my mouse here. But El Salvador here in the red, and then Nicaragua here in kind of this brown. So, just south of Mexico, but north of what we think of as South America. So, Central America here. So, Nicaragua. The U.S. had supported a dictator there named Anastasio Somoza Debayle. This is him here on the top right. And in 1979, so this is before Reagan's presidency, a Marxist group supported by Cuba, so remember Cuba is still a pain, in the U.S.'s butt at the time, takes over and they oust Somoza. So they take over and they kick out Somoza and they input this group called the Sandinista. And when Reagan takes office, he cuts off aid to the Sandinistas, and he approves $20 million for the CIA to equip and train a group to oppose them called the Contras. So Contra means go against, and he is supporting this group called the Contras. Now, this came to an end when the CIA conducts sabotage operations in Nicaragua without the approval of Congress, and the Contras were kind of a bad group as well. It came out that most of their money was funded through the drug trade. So again, there isn't really a good guy in this situation. There are a couple of rebel groups that are fighting against each other, but the Contras are fighting against communists, so it's seen as kind of this necessary evil in the world. So, Reagan was still determined to help out the Contras, and he had his administration kind of find ways around the Congress's restriction. There was an amendment put out that didn't allow the president to support rebel groups, but he still wanted to support them. So, these are some pictures here of the Contras. Again, they're rebel groups in Nicaragua. So, while dealing with these issues, there was also some problems in the Middle East. So, these American civilians in Lebanon, which is right next to Israel and everything like that, they were captured by this terrorist group that is supported by Iran. So, this group supported by Iran, captures American terrorists and hold them hostage. And so there's this scandal going on with this kind of alongside of this Contra issue and everything. So we can see over here on the left, Lebanon. It's a little country right on the Mediterranean Sea. And then, of course, our map here of the Caribbean. And then we have Nicaragua, and then El Salvador is over here. So in 1985, right in the middle of Reagan's presidency, his national security advisor is a guy named Robert McFarlane. And he persuades Reagan to approve the sale of weapons to Iran. So the idea here is they would make a deal with Iran, and they would provide Iran with weapons if Iran would release these U.S. hostages, if they would help, get these U.S. hostages released. Now, this goes against Reagan in his presidency, and he basically said prior to this that he would not negotiate with terrorists. And so this kind of goes against what Reagan is talking about in negotiating with terrorists. This seems to be a pretty clear negotiation tactic. So, the Iran-Contra affair unfolds when members of the National Security Council divert money from these illegal Iran arms sales to the Contras in Nicaragua. So, we have the United States. They are selling guns to Iran, and they are using that money from these sales to support the Contras. So, there's kind of several things going on here. First of all, you have this illegal Iran arms sale to the Contra to Iran, and then that money from the sale going to support the Contras, which again was unconstitutional. And so we have two people that are involved in this: Vice Admiral John Poindexter and then Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. So this is Oliver North here, and then the Admiral. So this is a controversy, and Oliver North kind of becomes the fall guy for this. He becomes the focal point of this, and things happen. Documents are shredded, And this becomes a huge, huge scandal because people aren't really sure what's going on with this issue. We have Iran, who is supporting these terrorists, and now we are making money from them and performing something unconstitutional by funding a rebel group in Nicaragua. So people want answers. And I really, really recommend if you're going to watch any video, go and watch this video. It's from American Dad. It's a couple minutes long, and it's about kind of this whole issue. And there's some pretty clear political leaning in this and everything like that, but it lays it out pretty well about what actually happened in the issue. So, when revealed, Congress launches an investigation. And this is similar to Watergate. It's highly publicized and everything like that. And President Reagan admits to authorizing the Iran arms sale, but denies knowledge of the money to the Contras. So he says, yes, I authorized these sales to Iran, but I did not know that this money was going to the Contras. So he kind of admits to a little bit of it, but not the full thing. So, of course, this is torn up by the press. And we have cartoons like this where we have presidents with very strong terms and everything like that. And then Reagan saying mistakes were made by somebody or other, or not me, and just an execution of policy or something. So again, Reagan, this strong communicator and stuff like that, there's some questions here of, is he really in power? What's happening here? What are some of these questions that are happening? So, a major social event during this time period was the AIDS epidemic. So, AIDS is an autoimmune disorder that was first diagnosed in 1981, so right at the beginning of Reagan's presidency. And by the end of his presidency, there were 83,000 cases reported here in the United States alone. And this was known as the gay plague because this was a huge plague on the gay community here in the United States. And a lot of people felt like that Reagan was turning a blind eye to this. There was very, very strong anti-gay sentiment in the United States, and some of that came from conservative groups. And so a lot of people felt like Reagan was not very strong on this. And it took him 5 years to even say the word AIDS in public. So while this epidemic is going on, the president really isn't even acknowledging it. So it takes him 7 years as well to make a speech on this crisis. And this would go on to kill 650,000 people here in the United States. And so again, we see political cartoons all the time. Should the president be blamed for not doing enough to fight this epidemic? Don't be ridiculous. And so, yeah, this is a big issue during the Reagan presidency. And then, of course, the courts as well. Remember, the president is the one that names the justices to the Supreme Court, and he ends up naming 3 conservative justices, which is a pretty large amount. And Sandra Day O'Connor becomes the first woman justice in the United States. And there was 2 major issues that the courts dealt with: affirmative action and the abortion issue. So we will stop here. Please go ahead and fill out that guided practice, and we'll see you soon.